Good evening and welcome. There is something about a snowstorm that changes everything. The world outside goes quiet, the roads disappear, the telephone lines go dead, and suddenly, the grand estate that once felt so welcoming feels very much like a trap. Tonight, we step inside Ashworth Manor, a place of old books, older secrets, and one very dead historian. The snow has sealed every door. No one can leave, no one can enter, and somewhere among the small gathering of guests trapped inside these walls is a murderer. But they made one mistake. Hercule Poirot is also snowed in. The little grey cells, he would say, tapping his temple with one gloved finger. They do not rest, not even in a snowstorm. If you enjoy mysteries told the old way, slow, careful, and devastatingly clever, then settle in. Pour yourself something warm. The storm is just beginning. The estate and the guests. The invitation had come on a Thursday. It was the sort of invitation one did not refuse, not when it bore the name of Sir Edmund Ashworth at the bottom, written in that heavy, deliberate hand of his, the ink pressed deep into the cream-colored paper, as though the man himself were standing over you, waiting for your answer. You are cordially invited to spend the weekend of the 14th at Ashworth Manor, Derbyshire. The occasion is informal. The company shall be select. I trust you will come. No question mark. Sir Edmund never asked. He informed. Hercule Poirot had received his own copy of this letter on a grey Friday morning in London, delivered along with his post and a small parcel of Belgian chocolates he had been expecting from a shop in Brussels. He had read the letter twice, set it beside his coffee cup, and spent several minutes regarding it with the expression of a man who suspects he is being walked into something but cannot yet say precisely what. He had met Sir Edmund Ashworth only once before, at a dinner in Mayfair, some 3 years past. The man was a historian of considerable reputation, the author of no fewer than 11 volumes on the English aristocracy and its various scandals. Through the centuries, he was also, Poirot had noted, the kind of man who collected people the way others collected stamps, carefully, deliberately, and always with some private purpose in mind. Still, the weekend promised a comfortable house, decent food, and the kind of quiet that London rarely offered in November. Poirot had accepted. He arrived at Ashworth Manor on the Friday afternoon, driven up from the village of Crest Hollow in a hired car whose heating had given up somewhere around the 2nd mile. The manor itself appeared through the bare trees like something from a watercolor, grey stone, tall chimneys, and windows that caught the last of the pale winter light and gave nothing back. It was, Poirot thought, a very beautiful house. It was also, he thought, a very cold one. He was not the first to arrive. In the drawing room, he found 4 other guests already assembled around a fire that was doing its best but losing the argument against the draughts coming in under the door. A young woman in a green dress stood nearest the window, looking out at the sky with an expression Poirot could not immediately read. A tall man, with the build of someone who had once been athletic and the complexion of someone who now preferred brandy, stood by the mantelpiece. Beside him, seated in a high-backed chair, with the particular stillness of a person who is listening to everything while appearing to listen to nothing, was a woman of perhaps 50, dressed in dark wool, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and in the corner, half hidden behind a copy of The Times, was a young man of 25 or so, who lowered his newspaper just long enough to register Poirot's arrival, and then raised it again. Sir Edmund himself came in a moment later, shaking Poirot's hand with the enthusiasm of a man who has pulled off something he is quietly proud of. Poirot, excellent! I was not entirely certain you would come, and yet you wrote as though you were, Poirot said pleasantly. Sir Edmund laughed, a short, dry sound. Old habit. Come, let me introduce you. The young woman by the window was Miss Clara Voss, 28, the daughter of a German academic, herself a researcher of some promise, who had been assisting Sir Edmund with his current manuscript. She had sharp eyes behind round spectacles, and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to being underestimated. The large man by the mantelpiece was Colonel Raymond Holt, retired, decorated, and in Poirot's private assessment, deeply unhappy about something he was working very hard not to show. He greeted Poirot with the excessive heartiness of a man who has practiced appearing at ease. The still woman in the chair was Mrs. Dorothea Fenwick, a widow, an old friend of Sir Edmund's late wife, and Sir Edmund explained with a vagueness that Poirot found immediately interesting. Practically family, Mrs. Fenwick offered her hand and said nothing beyond the necessary pleasantries, which told Poirot rather more than a longer speech might have done. The young man with the newspaper was Mr. Philip Ashworth, Sir Edmund's nephew, 26 years old, recently returned from 2 years abroad in circumstances that no one seemed inclined to elaborate upon. He folded his paper when introduced and gave Poirot a look that was polite on the surface and wary underneath. "And there is one more," Sir Edmund said. "Dr. Hargreaves is upstairs. He arrived this morning and has been in the library since. The man reads more than he breathes." Dr. Hargreaves. "Hargreaves," Poirot repeated. "James Hargreaves, rival historian, old colleague, occasional enemy." Sir Edmund said it with the lightness of a man making a joke, but his eyes did not smile. "We have known each other 30 years. He is writing a competing volume on the Ashworth family history. I invited him because it seemed better to have him inside the tent, so to speak." Poirot said nothing, but he filed the remark away with great care. Dinner that evening was served at 8 in a dining room that smelled of wood smoke and old silver. The food was good, a clear soup, a roast, a pudding, that Poirot found himself finishing rather more completely than he had intended. The conversation moved across the table in the way that conversation does when a group of people who do not entirely trust one another are trying to appear as though they do. Dr. Hargreaves had come down from the library in time for dinner, a thin, precise man of 60 with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now was merely sharp. He spoke little, ate methodically, and watched Sir Edmund across the table with an expression that Poirot, who had spent a lifetime reading faces, could only describe as old grievance. By the time the port came round, Poirot had decided 3 things. First, that this was not simply a social gathering. Second, that at least 2 people in this room knew it. Third, that it had begun to snow. He noticed the snow from the window as he made his way upstairs to bed, thick, deliberate flakes, falling with the quiet determination of something that intends to stay. By morning, he thought, the drive would be gone. By afternoon, the roads. He stood at the window for a moment longer than he needed to, watching the white accumulate on the garden below, on the hedges, on the stone bench near the wall where someone had left a pair of gardening gloves and not come back for them. Curious, he thought, very curious. Then he drew the curtain, turned away, and went to bed. He slept, on the whole, rather well, which was just as well, because it was the last peaceful sleep any of them would have for quite some time. The snow fell through the night without stopping. By morning, Ashworth Manor was sealed from the world entirely. And by morning, one of them was dead. The body is found. It was Mrs. Fenwick who found him. She would say later, to Poirot, to anyone who asked, and to several people who did not, that she had simply gone to return a book. That was all. A book she had borrowed from the library the previous evening, a slim volume on the Derbyshire estates of the 17th century, which Sir Edmund had pressed upon her after dinner with the insistence of a man who believes everyone ought to share his enthusiasms. She had woken early, as was her habit. The house was still and grey in that particular way of winter mornings, when the light comes in flat and cold, and makes everything look slightly unreal. She had dressed, taken the book from her bedside table, and made her way along the corridor toward the east wing, where the library sat at the end of the hall like a full stop at the end of a long sentence. The door was ajar. She pushed it open, and then she screamed. A single, sharp sound that cut through the silence of Ashworth Manor like a stone through ice, and brought every remaining soul in the house out of their beds and into the corridor within the space of 2 minutes. Poirot was among the last to arrive at the library door, not because he was slow, he was not, but because he had taken the time to put on his shoes properly, to straighten his collar and to collect himself before stepping into whatever awaited him. He had learned long ago that the first moments at the scene of a death were the most important, and they could not be recovered if wasted in haste. He came down the corridor to find the others already clustered in the doorway. Philip Ashworth, with his hair still disordered from sleep, Miss Voss gripping the doorframe with white knuckles, Colonel Holt standing very straight in the manner of military men confronted with death, as though posture might help. Dr. Hargreaves stood slightly apart from the others, his arms folded, his face unreadable. Mrs. Fenwick was seated on the small bench in the corridor. A housemaid crouched beside her, with a glass of water that Mrs. Fenwick was not drinking. Poirot looked at the assembled faces for precisely 3 seconds. Then he looked past them, into the library. It was a beautiful room, even now. 3 walls given entirely to books, floor to ceiling, dark oak shelving, the spines faded to the quiet colors of old things. A large desk near the window, papers arranged upon it with the particular neatness of a man who takes his work seriously. 2 leather armchairs near the fireplace, which had burned down to cold ash. A Turkish rug in reds and blues on the stone floor, and the tall windows at the far end, behind which the snow pressed white and solid against the glass, as though the world outside had simply ceased to exist. Sir Edmund Ashworth lay on the floor beside his desk. He was on his back, one arm extended, the fingers of his right hand still loosely curled around a fountain pen that had rolled but not fallen. His face was turned slightly to the left, toward the window, toward the snow. His expression was one Poirot had seen before. Not quite surprise, not quite peace, but something in between. As though the last thing Sir Edmund had registered was a thought he had not quite finished. There was no visible wound, no blood, no disorder of furniture or paper, nothing overturned, nothing broken. The room was perfectly still, perfectly arranged, as though Sir Edmund had simply decided to lie down on his Turkish rug and had not gotten up again. Poirot stepped inside. He moved carefully, not the careful movement of a man afraid, but of a man who understands that a room where someone has died is a document, and documents must be read before they are disturbed. He crouched beside the body with rather more difficulty than he would have liked. His knees, this winter, had developed opinions of their own, and studied Sir Edmund's face, his hands, the position of his body, the distance between him and the desk. The pen was interesting. He did not touch it. He looked at it for a long moment, then straightened up slowly and turned his attention to the desk. The papers were indeed neatly arranged. 2 stacks, a leather folder, an inkwell with its cap replaced. But there was something wrong with the arrangement, and it took Poirot a moment to identify precisely what it was. There was a space, a rectangular space in the center of the desk, slightly less dusty than the surrounding surface, where something had rested for a long time and was no longer there. "Has anyone touched anything in this room?" he asked it quietly, turning to face the doorway where the others still stood. Several of them shook their heads. "Jonske Mumath." Colonel Holt said, "Certainly not," with the firmness of a man offended by the suggestion. Mrs. Fenwick. Poirot looked toward the corridor. The older woman had composed herself somewhat. "I touched the door," she said. "It was already open. I only pushed it further. And I I may have taken a step inside. 2 steps, no more. Then I saw him and I—" She stopped. "You called out," Poirot said gently. "Yes." "That is perfectly understandable, madame." He turned back to the room. "The fire," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "It has been out for some hours. He was here in the night then." "The roads," Philip Ashworth said suddenly from the doorway. His voice was tight. "We need to call someone. The police. A doctor. Someone." "The telephone," Miss Voss said. She turned and went quickly down the corridor toward the hall. They heard her pick up the receiver. A pause. Then, "It's dead. The line is dead." Nobody spoke for a moment. Outside the library windows, the snow continued to fall. It was Colonel Holt who said what everyone was thinking. "We're cut off." "It would appear so," Poirot agreed. "Then we're stuck here. All of us." Philip Ashworth looked around at the group with an expression that was difficult to interpret, somewhere between alarm and something else. Something more controlled. He did not finish the sentence. "With a dead man," Dr. Hargreaves said flatly. He had still not moved from his position slightly apart from the others. "Yes, that is the situation." Poirot looked at him. "You do not seem surprised, Doctor." Hargreaves met his gaze without flinching. "I am a man of 60, Monsieur Poirot. I have seen death before." "As have I," Poirot said mildly. "And yet I find that one never quite becomes accustomed." Hargreaves said nothing, but something moved behind his eyes. Just briefly, just a flicker, before his expression settled again into its customary sharpness. Poirot asked them all to go to the drawing room and wait. He asked it as a request, in the polite and gentle way he had, which nonetheless carried the quality of something that was not entirely optional. They went, Mrs. Fenwick leaning on the housemaid's arm, Colonel Holt with his jaw set, Philip Ashworth casting one last look back at the library door as though he expected it to tell him something. Miss Voss paused in the doorway before leaving. "Do you know what happened to him?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands, Poirot noticed, were not. "Not yet," he said. "But I will." She nodded once and went. Poirot stood alone in the library. He stood there for a long time, longer, perhaps, than was strictly necessary, looking at the room, at the body, at the empty space on the desk, at the windows where the snow had now built up along the lower panes, cutting off even the thin grey light of the morning. He was tired, he realized. He had not slept as well as he had believed. There was a stiffness in his shoulders and a faint ache behind his eyes that he associated with cold houses and insufficient sleep and the particular weight that came with standing in rooms where violent things had happened. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his temple. "Alors," he thought. "Think." The little grey cells stirred, slowly at first, as they sometimes did in the mornings, and began their work. A historian was dead. A manuscript was missing. And 7 people were sealed inside a house with no way out and no way to call for help. Somewhere in this manor, behind one of these carefully composed faces, was the answer. Poirot intended to find it, even if the snow did not melt for a week. Poirot begins his inquiry. He began with the room, not with the people. Not yet. The people could wait. People, in Poirot's long experience, were remarkably consistent in their inconsistencies. They would lie, and then they would contradict their lies, and then they would lie again in a slightly different direction. And eventually, if one was patient enough, the truth would emerge from the gaps between all those careful untruths, like water finding its way through stone. But a room did not lie. A room simply was, and if one looked at it properly, without hurry, without assumption, it told you everything it knew. Poirot began at the door. The lock was intact. No sign of force, no scratching around the keyhole that might suggest someone had worked at it from outside. The door itself opened inward, smoothly, without resistance. Well-maintained hinges. The kind of small domestic detail that spoke of a household run with care and consistency. He moved to the windows next. There were 3 of them, tall, narrow, set deep into the stone walls in the manner of older houses. Each had a brass latch. He examined all 3. The first 2 were latched firmly from the inside. The third, the one nearest the desk, was also latched. But when Poirot looked more closely at the latch itself, he saw something that made him pause. A faint mark, a thin line in the brass. Recent enough to still be bright against the older tarnish around it. He did not touch it. He straightened up and looked out through the glass at the snow, which had drifted up against the exterior sill to a depth of perhaps 8 inches. No footprints, no disturbance. Whatever that mark meant, it did not mean someone had come in through the window last night. He turned back to the room, the desk next. He sat down in Sir Edmund's chair, carefully, with a slight sense of transgression he always felt when occupying a dead man's seat, and looked at the surface from that angle. The 2 stacks of paper, the leather folder, the inkwell. He opened the leather folder. Empty. He looked at it for a moment, then set it aside and examined the 2 stacks of paper. The first was correspondence. Letters received, arranged by date, the most recent on top. He did not read them in detail, not yet, but he noted the names on several of them, a publisher in London, a colleague at Oxford, and 3 letters down, Dr. James Hargreaves, the most recent dated 6 weeks ago. He set that stack aside also and turned to the second. These were manuscript pages, typewritten, corrected in Sir Edmund's hand in red ink, numbered in the upper right corner. He checked the numbering. The pages ran from 1 to 47, and then jumped to 63. Pages 48 through 62 were missing. He sat with that for a moment. 15 pages. Not the whole manuscript, just a section of it. Someone had not taken the work then. Someone had taken a specific part of the work, which meant someone knew what was in those 15 pages, which meant, almost certainly, that whatever was in those 15 pages had gotten Sir Edmund Ashworth killed. He found the cup on the small table beside the nearer armchair. It was a china teacup, white with a blue border, the kind found in every English country house, from here to Cornwall. There was perhaps a 1/4 inch of liquid remaining in the bottom, dark and faintly viscous in the way of tea that has been sitting for many hours. Beside the cup, a small plate with a single biscuit on it, untouched. Poirot looked at the cup for a long time. Then he took a clean handkerchief from his pocket. He always carried 2, a habit of 30 years, and very carefully, using the handkerchief to avoid touching the handle directly, lifted the cup and brought it close to his face. He smelled it. Underneath the cold tea, underneath the tannin and the faint staleness of a drink gone long cold, there was something else, something faintly bitter, faintly chemical, in the manner of something that did not belong there. He set the cup down with great care and stood very still for a moment. Then he took his small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote 3 words. He did not write them in French or in English, but in a private shorthand he had developed over many years, which no one else had ever been able to read. This was intentional. The body he examined last, and briefly. He was not a doctor. He had never pretended to be one, and he had learned long ago that amateur medical conclusions were among the most dangerous things a detective could allow himself. But he had stood in enough rooms with enough dead people to notice certain things that did not require a medical degree. Sir Edmund's hands were unmarked. No defensive wounds, no bruising around the knuckles, no sign that he had struggled with anyone. His collar was undisturbed. His jacket was buttoned. He had died, by all appearances, exactly as he had been sitting, quietly, in his chair, and had then somehow come to rest on the floor beside it. The chair itself was pushed back from the desk at an angle, the angle of a man who has risen quickly or fallen. Poirot looked at the distance between the chair and where Sir Edmund lay, 3 feet, perhaps 3 1/2. A man who simply fainted would not fall 3 feet from his chair. A man who rose, who stood, and then fell, might. He had stood up. Something had made him stand. Poirot left the library, pulling the door closed behind him, and made his way to the drawing room. They were all there, arranged around the room, with the particular stiffness of people who have been waiting in anxiety and trying not to show it. A fire had been lit. One of the housemaids, a sensible girl named Agnes, had seen to it, and a tray of coffee sat on the low table, mostly untouched. Outside the drawing-room windows, the snow continued its patient, indifferent work. Poirot stood before them and looked at each face in turn. He did this without apology and without hurry, and several of them found it uncomfortable, which was, in part, the intention. "I thank you for your patience," he said. "I have some questions. I shall try not to take more of your time than is necessary. I ask only that you answer me honestly, which I appreciate is sometimes more difficult than it sounds." Colonel Holt made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been impatience. Poirot chose to interpret it charitably. "Last evening," he began, "after dinner, at what hour did each of you retire?" Miss Voss had gone up at 10:30. She was certain of this, because she had checked her watch when she reached her room, a habit she explained without being asked. She had trouble sleeping in unfamiliar houses and liked to know how many hours she had before morning. She had heard nothing unusual in the night. She had seen Sir Edmund go into the library at approximately 10 o'clock, just before she herself went upstairs. Colonel Holt had stayed in the drawing-room until nearly midnight, finishing the brandy decanter with what he described as reasonable restraint and what Poirot privately assessed as rather less than that. He had gone to bed and slept soundly. He had seen nothing, heard nothing. Mrs. Fenwick had retired early, 9 o'clock, perhaps a little before. She was a light sleeper, she said, and she had heard footsteps in the corridor at some point in the night, though she could not say precisely when. She had assumed it was one of the housemaids. Philip Ashworth said he had gone to his room at 11 and had not come out until he heard Mrs. Fenwick scream. His manner as he said this was carefully neutral, in a way that Poirot noted. Dr. Hargreaves had retired at 10:30. He had read for perhaps an hour and then slept. He offered this information concisely, without elaboration, in the manner of a man answering examination questions. Poirot listened to all of it. He asked no follow-up questions. Not yet. He simply listened and nodded and wrote occasionally in his notebook and watched their faces while they watched him. When they had all spoken, he was quiet for a moment. "One more question," he said. "Sir Edmund's current manuscript, the work he was writing. Did any of you know its contents? Specifically, what it contained beyond the general subject of the Ashworth family history?" The silence that followed was very brief. A second, perhaps 2. But in that second, something passed through the room. Not a sound, not a movement. Something subtler than either. 2 people looked at the floor. One person looked at Poirot with an expression of very careful blankness, and one person, just one, looked, very quickly and entirely involuntarily, at Dr. Hargreaves. Poirot did not follow that look. He kept his own eyes on the middle distance, his expression pleasantly neutral. But he had seen it. He had seen everything. He excused himself shortly after and went upstairs on the pretext of freshening up before lunch. It was nearly noon by now, and Agnes had indicated that cold cuts and bread could be managed despite the circumstances. He sat on the edge of his bed for a moment and pressed his fingers to his eyes. His head ached. It had been aching since the library, a dull, persistent thing at the back of his skull that he associated with cold and insufficient breakfast and the particular mental effort of holding 6 people's accounts simultaneously in one's mind and looking for the places where they did not quite fit together. He was not, he reflected, as young as he had been. He stood, went to the window, and looked out at the snow. It showed no sign whatsoever of stopping. Bon, he thought. Neither shall I. The questions had been asked. The answers had been given. But answers, Poirot knew, were only the beginning. It was the spaces between them, the hesitations, the misdirected glances, and the carefully composed silences that contained the truth. And somewhere in this snowbound house, the truth was waiting to be found. Secret Surface Lunch was a quiet affair. Agnes had done what she could. Cold meats, bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and a pot of tea that was at least hot, even if everything else about the meal was not. They sat around the dining table with the particular stiffness of people who are sharing a space they would very much rather not be sharing, and the conversation moved in short, careful bursts, like a fire that keeps threatening to go out. Poirot ate little. He was not hungry, which was, for him, a reliable indicator that his mind was working harder than usual, pulling resources from elsewhere. He drank his tea and watched the table. It was Philip Ashworth who broke first, not dramatically. There was no outburst, no sudden confession. It was simply that, midway through the meal, when the silence had stretched a little too long, and Mrs. Fenwick had said something bland about the weather, Philip set down his fork with a small, deliberate click and said, "I think we ought to talk about the will." Everyone looked at him. "Philip," Mrs. Fenwick said, in a tone that suggested this was not the first time she had used his name as a warning. No, he looked around the table, not aggressively, but with the expression of a man who has decided that a thing needs saying and has committed to saying it. "We are all sitting here pretending this is an ordinary lunch, and it is not. My uncle is dead in the library. We cannot leave. We cannot call anyone. And I think," he paused, "I think certain people at this table already know things they have not said." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ones before it. Poirot set down his teacup. "You are referring," he said quietly, "to the terms of Sir Edmund's will." Philip looked at him. "You know about it." "I know nothing about it," Poirot said. "I am asking because you raised the subject, and I find it suggestive that you raised it within 12 hours of your uncle's death." A faint color rose in Philip's face. "I raised it because it's relevant." "Then please," Poirot said, "tell us why." The story came out in pieces, the way these things always did, not in a clean line, but in fragments, each one requiring a small amount of pressure before it yielded. Philip had learned 3 weeks ago from the family solicitor in London that Sir Edmund had recently amended his will. The previous version, made some years ago, had left the bulk of the estate to Philip, as the only surviving member of the immediate family. The amended version was different. He left the manor to a historical preservation trust, Philip said. The contents of the library, all of it, every book, every paper, every manuscript, to Oxford, and the remainder of the liquid assets. He stopped. "To whom?" Poirot asked. Philip looked across the table. "To Miss Voss." Every head turned toward Clara Voss. She did not flinch. She sat very straight, her hands flat on the table, and met the collective regard of the room with an composure that Poirot found, in the circumstances, remarkable. "I knew," she said. "He told me himself 6 weeks ago. I did not ask for it. I did not—" She stopped, seemed to collect herself. "I told him I did not want it. He said that was precisely why he was leaving it to me." "How very convenient," Colonel Holt said, in a voice from which he had not quite managed to remove all the edge. "Colonel." Poirot's voice was mild, but it stopped Holt as effectively as a hand on the shoulder. "Convenience is not evidence." He looked back at Miss Voss. "The work you were doing for Sir Edmund, the research assistants, how long had this arrangement been in place?" 2 years, she said. "Nearly 2.5. And in that time, did you come to know the contents of his current manuscript well?" A brief pause. "Yes. I typed much of it. I organized his notes. Yes, I knew it well." "The section that is missing," Poirot said, pages 48 through 62. Do you know what those pages contained? This pause was longer. Yes, she said finally. I know what they contained, she told them. The missing pages, she said, concerned a specific period in the Ashworth family history, the 1890s, specifically the years between 1893 and 1897. Sir Edmund had been researching with what Miss Voss described as increasing obsession over the past year, a series of financial transactions made by his grandfather, the first Sir Edmund Ashworth, during those years. What he had found, and what those 15 pages documented in detail, with sources, was that the first Sir Edmund had come into his considerable fortune not through the inheritance he had always claimed, but through a sustained and deliberate fraud, specifically the systematic falsification of land records across 3 counties, by which he had acquired properties belonging to families who had no idea their titles had been forged. He stole it, Philip said flatly. The whole estate, the whole fortune. The documentation supports that conclusion, Miss Voss said. Your uncle believed it was incontrovertible. And he intended to publish this, Poirot said. He did. He felt. She paused again, choosing her words. He felt that the truth was the truth, regardless of whom it reflected badly upon. Even himself. Even his own family. Philip was staring at the table. Something was moving across his face that Poirot watched with interest. Not grief, not anger, but a complicated rearrangement of understanding, as though several things that had not made sense were now making sense in a way he did not entirely welcome. It was Mrs. Fenwick who spoke next, and what she said surprised everyone at the table, including, Poirot suspected, herself. James knew, she said. Dr. Hargreaves, who had been silent throughout this entire exchange, looked at her sharply. Dorothea, he began. He knew, she said again, more firmly. Edmund told me 2 months ago that James had somehow obtained a copy of the draft, the relevant section. Edmund was furious. He believed James intended to use the information, to publish it himself, or to, she stopped, to use it as leverage, Poirot said. Mrs. Fenwick looked at him. Yes. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Everyone looked at Dr. Hargreaves. He sat very still for a moment. Then he unfolded his arms. He had been sitting with them folded since the beginning of lunch, and placed his hands on the table with the deliberateness of a man making a considered decision. I did obtain a copy, he said. Edmund left the relevant pages in the study at his London house when I visited in September. I read them. I should not have done so, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. He paused. I did not use them as leverage. I approached Edmund and told him what I had read. We had a disagreement. A disagreement, Colonel Holt repeated, with heavy emphasis. A significant one, Hargreaves said evenly. I told him that publishing that information would cause irreparable damage, not only to the Ashworth name, but to the families whose history would be rewritten by it. He told me that was not his concern. I told him that I would take steps to prevent publication if he proceeded. He looked around the table. I said that in anger. I did not mean it as a threat. And yet, Poirot said gently, here we are. The silence that followed was the longest yet. Poirot excused himself from the table before the others and went to find Mrs. Fenwick alone, which he managed by the simple method of waiting in the corridor outside the dining room until she emerged, as he had calculated she would, some minutes before the rest. She did not seem surprised to find him there. You wish to speak with me, she said. It was not a question. I wish to ask you something that I did not wish to ask in front of the others, Poirot said. You described yourself as practically family to Sir Edmund. You have known him for many years, I think, since before his wife died, she said. 31 years. Then you knew him well enough to know when he was frightened. Mrs. Fenwick looked at him steadily. What are you asking? Monsieur Poirot? I am asking, he said, whether Sir Edmund in the days before this weekend gave you any indication that he was afraid. Not worried, not anxious in the ordinary sense. Afraid. A long pause. He telephoned me, she said at last. 4 days ago, on Tuesday evening. He said, she stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. He said that he had made an error of judgment, that he had shown someone something he ought not to have shown them, and that he was not certain what they intended to do with the knowledge. Did he say who? No, he would not say. I asked him twice. She paused. He said he intended to resolve it this weekend. That was why he had assembled this particular group. He said he wanted everyone in one place where he could manage things. He wished to control the situation, Poirot said. Edmund always wished to control the situation, Mrs. Fenwick said, with a sadness that was not unkind. It was his greatest quality and his greatest flaw. Poirot nodded slowly. One more thing, madame. The footsteps you heard in the corridor last night. You said you could not determine the time, but can you tell me? Were they going in one direction or two? Did you hear someone pass and then return? Mrs. Fenwick was quiet for a moment. 2 directions, she said. Yes, someone went and then came back. I had forgotten that. She looked at him. Is it important? In my experience, Poirot said, everything is important. The difficulty is knowing which things are important in which direction. He thanked her and walked back toward the staircase. Behind him, the dining room door opened and the others began to emerge, their voices low and cautious. The way voices are when people are trying to gauge what has just happened and what it means for them specifically. Poirot did not look back. He was thinking about footsteps, about 15 missing pages, about a cup of tea with something in it that did not belong there, about a mark on a brass latch that meant nothing and might mean everything, about a man who had assembled his enemies in a snowbound house in order to manage them and had instead managed to get himself killed. And he was thinking, with the particular quality of thought that meant he was close, that the shape of the thing was beginning to emerge from the fog, about the one detail that none of them had mentioned, the one detail that everyone in that house should have mentioned, and hadn't. The secrets had begun to surface, one by one, like objects rising through thawing ice. But the most important secret, the one that connected all the others, had not yet shown itself. Poirot could feel it, somewhere just beyond his reach, patient and cold and waiting. The little grey cell's work. He went back to the library. He knew he would, had known it since lunch, in the way that one knows a thing without quite admitting it to oneself. There was something in that room he had not finished with, something he had seen and registered and then set aside, in the manner of a man who files a paper away, knowing he will need it later, but not yet knowing precisely why. The corridor was empty. The house had settled into the particular quiet of a winter afternoon, that heavy, padded silence that snow produces, as though the world outside has wrapped itself in wool. From somewhere below, he could hear the faint domestic sounds of Agnes moving about in the kitchen, and once, briefly, the low murmur of voices from the drawing room, where he had asked the others to remain. He pushed open the library door and went in. It was colder than before. The fire had not been relit. He had asked Agnes specifically not to touch anything in this room, and she had obliged with the slightly wide-eyed compliance of a young woman who has had a very unusual morning. The cold had settled into the room the way cold settles into old stone houses, thoroughly, proprietorially, as though it belonged there and the warmth had merely been visiting. Sir Edmund was still on the floor. Poirot stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him with the expression he always wore in these moments, not detached exactly, but composed. There was a kind of respect in it, he felt. The dead deserved at least that. Then he moved to the desk. He sat down again in Sir Edmund's chair, and this time He did not look at the papers. He looked at the desk itself, the surface, the drawers, the small details of a workspace that had been used by the same person for many years and had therefore absorbed something of that person's habits and preferences the way old furniture does. The drawers. He had not opened them this morning. He opened them now. The top drawer, pens, a spare inkwell, a folding ruler, a small bottle of aspirin, half empty, and a pocket diary bound in brown leather. He took the diary out and set it on the desk. The second drawer, correspondence folders, neatly labelled in Sir Edmund's hand. He flipped through them briefly, nothing immediately striking, though he noted one folder labelled simply H, which he set beside the diary. The third drawer, locked. Poirot looked at the locked drawer for a moment. Then he looked at Sir Edmund's body, specifically at his jacket, specifically at the breast pocket of his jacket. He rose, crossed the room, crouched beside the body with the effortful care his knees now required, and reached into the breast pocket. A key, small, brass, unremarkable, the kind that might open any number of small locks, a diary, a box, a desk drawer. He straightened up slowly and went back to the desk. The key fit. Inside the third drawer was a single envelope. It was sealed, and on the front, in Sir Edmund's handwriting, were 3 words, "In case of." Poirot sat with the envelope in his hands for a long moment. It was the kind of moment he had learned, over the years, to give its proper weight. A sealed envelope, left by a man who is now dead, bearing 3 words that formed the beginning of a sentence the man had not finished writing, or had not wished to finish, was not a small thing. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it. It was not a letter in the conventional sense, no salutation, no signature. It was a list, 7 lines, written in Sir Edmund's precise hand, each line consisting of a name followed by a brief phrase. He read it once through, then he read it again. Then he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for rather a long time. The pocket diary was more forthcoming than he had expected. Sir Edmund had been a faithful diarist, not in the personal, emotional sense, but in the practical one. Each day's entry was brief and factual. Appointments, observations, reminders to himself, the occasional dry remark about a meeting or a conversation. The entries for the past 6 weeks told a story that Poirot read with increasing attention. Sept 14. H came. Unpleasant. He has seen the pages. Expected anger. Got calculation instead. More dangerous. Sept 22. Spoke with solicitor. Amendments as discussed. Octave 3. CV asked again about the publication date. Told her spring. She seems uneasy. Why? Oct 19. Package arrived. No sender. Contents. Pages 48 to 62. My own typescript. Someone is telling me they have a copy and want me to know it. Nov 1. Telephone call. Voice disguised, or attempting to be. The message was clear enough. They want me to withdraw the manuscript. I will not. Nov 7. Have decided. Weekend at Ashworth. Bring them all together. See their faces. This cannot be managed from a distance. Nov 12. RH called. Strange conversation. He asked about the library, specifically. Why the library? Poirot stopped. He read that last line again. He asked about the library, specifically. Why the library? R.H. Raymond Holt. He set the diary down and looked out the snow-covered window, and for the first time since the morning, something in his mind shifted. Not dramatically, not with the sudden illumination of a switched light, but with the slow, grinding certainty of a key turning in a lock that has been stiff for a long time. He went through the room a 3rd time. He was looking for something specific now, something that the earlier examination had not been directed toward, because he had not yet known to look for it. He moved slowly, methodically, touching nothing he did not need to touch, disturbing nothing he did not need to disturb. He found it behind the second armchair, a small glass, not china, not the teacup, but a proper drinking glass, the kind used for water or whiskey. It had rolled against the base of the bookshelf and come to rest there, out of the direct line of sight from the door. It was empty, and had been empty long enough to show no residue, but when Poirot brought it close to his face and applied the same careful attention he had given the teacup, the same faint bitterness reached him. 2 vessels, the same substance in both. He sat in the armchair, the second one, not the one nearest the desk, and looked at the room from this angle. From here, the desk was to his left, the door was directly ahead, the windows were to his right, the snow white and absolute beyond them. From here, a second person sitting in this chair would have been visible from the desk and invisible from the door. He looked at the small table between the 2 armchairs. 1 coaster, not 2. 1 person had been expected, 2 had been present. He was back in his room by 4 o'clock, sitting at the small writing table near the window, with his notebook open before him, working through it systematically, in the way he always did, when enough pieces had assembled themselves to begin construction. The notebook contained, in his private shorthand, the following: the substance in the cup and glass, not conclusive without a laboratory, but consistent with one of several compounds that could be obtained without particular difficulty by a person of education and means. Administered in 2 vessels suggested a shared drink, a meeting, not an ambush, the missing pages, taken before or after death. If before, the killer had them. If after, also the killer, but with a different implication for the sequence of events. The locked drawer and its envelope. Sir Edmund had known he was in danger. The list of names and notations suggested he had known specifically who posed that danger and why. Why had he not acted? Because, Poirot thought, he had believed he could manage it. He had believed, right up until the last moment, that he was in control. The diary entry about Colonel Holt asking about the library. The 2 directions of footsteps Mrs. Fenwick had heard. The mark on the window latch. The space on the desk where something had rested. He put down his pen and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. A gesture he would not have made in company, too undignified, but alone in a cold room in the late afternoon with a headache that had not improved. He permitted himself the small concession. He thought about the list in the envelope. He thought about what it meant if the name he suspected was indeed the correct one. He thought about motive and opportunity and the specific, unglamorous practicalities of how a thing like this was actually done. Not in the abstract, not as a puzzle, but as a human act, committed by a human being, in a state of sufficient desperation or calculation to cross the line that most people spent their lives never approaching. Someone in this house had sat across from Sir Edmund Ashworth and shared a drink with him and put something in that drink, not in a moment of passion, not impulsively, with preparation, with the necessary materials obtained in advance, with a plan for afterward, the missing pages, the arrangement of the room, the return journey down the corridor that Mrs. Fenwick had heard. This was not a crime of feeling, this was a crime of necessity, which meant, and here Poirot felt the shape of it settle into final clarity, the way the last piece of a mosaic settles, and suddenly the image is whole, which meant that the killer was still afraid. The pages had been taken, but the danger had not passed. There was still something they needed, still something that could expose them, which meant they would act again. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked at himself briefly in the small mirror above the writing table. He looked tired. He was tired. His head ached, and his knees ached, and the cold of the house had settled into him in the persistent way of cold that has had all day to work at a person. He looked, he thought, like a man of a certain age in a snowbound house who had spent the day in rooms with dead men and insufficient heating. He also looked, he thought, like a man who knew the answer. He picked up his notebook, put on his jacket, and went downstairs. It was time to finish it. The grey cells had done their work. The picture was complete. Not in every detail, not with every proof in hand, but in the essential shape of it, the way that mattered. Poirot knew who had killed Sir Edmund Ashworth, and he knew why. And he knew, with the particular cold certainty that came at the end of these things, that he was not the only one in the house who was running out of time. The revelation. He gathered them at 5 o'clock, not in the drawing room. He had chosen the library deliberately, and when Agnes carried his message to each of them in turn, he had been specific about the location. He wanted them in that room. He wanted them to feel what a room feels like, when it still contains the memory of what happened in it. People were different in such rooms. Defenses that held perfectly well in comfortable surroundings had a way of developing small, significant cracks when the surroundings were not comfortable at all. They came in one by one and arranged themselves with the instinctive care of people who are about to be examined. Miss Voss nearest the door, her hands folded, her face composed into the careful stillness she wore when she was most uncertain. Colonel Holt by the mantelpiece again, his default position, the place that gave him the illusion of commanding the room. Mrs. Fenwick in the high-backed chair that had been moved slightly from its usual position. She noticed this and looked at Poirot briefly and said nothing. Philip Ashworth stood near the window, his back to the snow, his face in shadow. Dr. Hargreaves was the last to enter. He looked at the room. He looked at Sir Edmund's body, which remained where it had been. Poirot had specifically asked that it not be moved, and something passed across his face too quickly to be named. Then he found a position near the bookshelves, and stood with his arms at his sides, and waited. Poirot stood before the fireplace. The fire had been lit. He had asked Agnes to light it an hour ago, and it had taken hold properly now, casting the room in the amber and shadow of real firelight, which was a different quality of light entirely from the grey afternoon that pressed against the windows. In this light, the library looked almost as it must have looked on any ordinary evening. Warm, bookish, civilized, almost. "I am going to tell you what happened," Poirot said. "I will ask you to be patient with me, because it is important that I tell it in the correct order. The correct order is not always the most dramatic, but it is the most truthful. And in this matter, truth is the only thing that serves any of us." Nobody spoke. "Sir Edmund Ashworth was poisoned," Poirot said. "The substance was administered in his tea, the cup that sits on the table beside that chair, and also in a second glass, found behind the other armchair, which has been less noticed because it rolled out of the immediate line of sight." He paused. 2 glasses, which means Sir Edmund did not drink alone. Someone sat with him in this room, in the second armchair, and shared a drink with him, and that person put something into Sir Edmund's cup that was not in their own glass. He let that settle. "The substance itself I cannot name with certainty. That requires a laboratory, and a laboratory is not at present available to us. But I have smelled it in both vessels, and I am sufficiently familiar with such things to say with confidence that it was not something one finds in a country house kitchen. It was brought here. It was obtained in advance. This was planned." Colonel Holt shifted his weight. "Planned? You're saying it was premeditated?" "I am saying exactly that. Now," Poirot continued, "let us consider who knew Sir Edmund well enough to sit with him in this room at, we estimate, somewhere between 10 o'clock and midnight, sharing a drink, without Sir Edmund finding this unusual or alarming, because that is essential. He was not surprised by his visitor. He admitted them willingly. He poured, or accepted, a drink in their company, which means this was someone he trusted." He looked around the room. "It also means, and this is equally important, that his visitor knew him well enough to understand his habits. Sir Edmund worked in the evenings. He kept a drink near his chair when he did so. He was a creature of routine, as people who live alone in large houses often become. His visitor used that routine against him. That description, Dr. Hargreaves said carefully, could apply to several people in this room. It could, Poirot agreed. And so we must look at the other details. He moved to the desk. Sir Edmund's diary, he said. Placing one hand briefly on the small brown volume, records a conversation with Colonel Holt. He did not look at Holt, but he was aware of the precise quality of the man's stillness, in which the colonel asked specifically about the library. Not about the weekend in general, not about the guest list or the arrangements, about the library. A pause. Why? Poirot said. Does a man who is invited for a social weekend ask, in advance, about a specific room? I asked, because Edmund mentioned he kept his manuscript here, Holt said. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it now. A tension, like a wire pulled too tight. I was curious about his work. That's all. You were curious, Poirot repeated gently. Yes. Let us hold that thought. He turned slightly. Mrs. Fenwick told me that she heard footsteps in the corridor last night. Footsteps going in one direction, and then returning. The library is at the end of this corridor. There is nowhere else to go from here. Whoever those footsteps belonged to came to this room and went back. The return journey, the coming back, is what interests me. He let a brief silence develop. A person who came to this room, sat with Sir Edmund, put something in his drink, and waited. A person who had done that would not leave immediately. They would wait. They would need to be certain, and when they were certain, they would take what they had come for. The missing pages, 48 through 62, the pages that documented the fraud that built this estate. And then they would go back to their room. Colonel Holt, Poirot said. The name landed in the room with a particular weight. Holt looked at him. His face had changed, not broken, not collapsed, but changed in the way that faces change when a man decides that a performance has run its course. The heartiness was gone. What remained was something older and harder and, Poirot thought, not without its own dignity. You served with the Ashworth family solicitor's son, Poirot said. In the war. I noted the photograph on Sir Edmund's desk. 3 men in uniform. And one of them is a younger version of the man I see before me now. And another I recognize from a portrait in the hall as a Rawlings, which is the name of the solicitor's family, an old connection, old enough that when Sir Edmund amended his will 6 weeks ago, removing you from a secondary bequest you had held for 11 years, you learned of it almost immediately. Holt said nothing. You came here this weekend, not for social reasons, but because you needed those pages. The pages documented the original fraud, but they also, I suspect, documented something more recent. Something in Sir Edmund's research that connected the original crimes to their present consequences. To land holdings, perhaps. To assets that are still held under false title. Poirot paused. Assets that you had a personal stake in. Through the Rawlings connection, through decades of careful arrangement, you had benefited from the silence around that history. If Sir Edmund published, if it became known, the consequences for you specifically would have been significant. Significant, Holt said, with a short, humorless sound that was almost a laugh. That's one word for it. Raymond, Mrs. Fenwick said, very quietly. He looked at her. Something moved across his face. Not quite regret, not quite apology, but something in that territory. I didn't plan it, he said. I want to be clear about that. I came here intending to reason with him, to make him understand what publication would mean, not just for me, for others, for families, for... He stopped. Edmund was the most unreasonable man I have ever known when he believed he was right. And he always believed he was right. So you brought the means with you, Poirot said. Just in case reason failed. A silence. Yes, Holt said. The word dropped into the room, and nobody moved for a moment. Miss Voss had both hands pressed flat against her thighs. Philip Ashworth had turned from the window and was looking at Holt with an expression that contained more exhaustion than anger. Mrs. Fenwick was looking at the fire. Dr. Hargreaves had his eyes on the middle distance, with the specific quality of a man who had suspected this, and finds no satisfaction in being right. He wouldn't listen, Holt said. He was not speaking to Poirot now, or not only to Poirot. He was speaking, it seemed, to the room itself, to the books and the firelight and the cold window glass. I came in here it was 10:30, perhaps 11:15. He was at his desk. He seemed almost pleased to see me, which I thought was. He stopped. He poured whiskey. We talked. I told him everything, what publication would mean, the specific consequences, the people who would be hurt. He listened. He was very calm about it. And then he said, Holt's jaw tightened for a moment. He said he had expected this conversation, and that his answer was no, and had always been no, and that I might as well save us both the difficulty of further discussion. And so you put it in his glass, Poirot said. It was already in my pocket, Holt said. Yes, I put it in the cup when he went to put another log on the fire. He had his back to me for perhaps 30 seconds. He paused. He didn't notice. We talked for another 20 minutes, perhaps. He seemed quite himself. And then he said he was tired and intended to work for another hour and then retire. And I said good night, and I left. And then you came back, Poirot said. An hour later, to take the pages. Holt looked at the floor where Sir Edmund lay, and for the first time, something in his face that might have been grief showed itself briefly before being controlled again. He was already on the floor. I took the pages from the desk. I left. The mark on the window latch, Poirot said. You considered the window as a means of arranging the scene, to suggest someone had entered from outside. I considered it, Holt said. I didn't do it. It seemed. He paused. It seemed unnecessary and beneath me. Poirot nodded slowly. He looked at Colonel Raymond Holt, a man of 70, decorated, upright, who had served his country and run his estate and arranged, over the course of many decades, a life of considerable respectability. And he felt the thing he always felt at these moments, which was not triumph and was not satisfaction, but was something quieter and more complicated than either. The police will come, Poirot said. When the snow clears, a day, perhaps 2. You will remain here until they do. I think you understand that. I understand, Holt said. And the pages. Holt reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a folded sheaf of typescript. 15 pages, slightly compressed from being carried against his body for the better part of a day. He held them out. Poirot took them and set them on the desk beside the diary and the envelope, the small archive of a dead man's careful work. The others left the library gradually, Mrs. Fenwick first, without a word, without looking at Holt, then Philip, who paused in the doorway and looked back at the room for a long moment before going, then Miss Voss, who stopped beside Poirot briefly and said, very quietly, thank you, and then appeared to find this insufficient and went out without adding to it. Dr. Hargreaves was last, besides Holt. He stopped beside Poirot on his way out. You knew before you gathered us, he said. It was not quite a question. I knew enough, Poirot said. The rest, he gestured slightly, a small movement of one hand. The rest he gave me himself. Hargreaves considered this. Edmund would have found that fitting, he said. He always said the truth finds its own way out eventually. A pause. He was insufferable about it, but he was usually right. He went out. Poirot stood alone in the library, for the 3rd time that day. The fire was properly established now, and the room was warmer than it had been, warmer than at any point since this morning, when Mrs. Fenwick had pushed open the door and found what she found. The firelight moved across the bookshelves, and the dark wood, and the face of Sir Edmund Ashworth, who lay where he had lain all day with the undemanding patience of the dead. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. "You assembled them all," he said, quietly, to the empty room. "You brought them here to manage them, and in doing so, you gave one of them the opportunity he needed." He paused. "You were a very clever man, Sir Edmund, but you made the mistake of underestimating how afraid a man can become when everything he has built is threatened." He picked up his notebook from the desk. His head still ached. His knees still ached. He was cold and tired and ready, in the profound and specific way that came at the end of these things, for a cup of proper coffee and a night of uninterrupted sleep, neither of which were immediately available to him. He looked at the windows. Outside, in the last of the grey winter light, the snow was finally, gently, tentatively, beginning to slow, not stopping, not yet, but easing. By morning, he thought, the roads might be passable. By morning, the world outside Ashworth Manor would begin to reassert itself. The police, the formalities, the long and necessary machinery of justice. For now, there was only this: a warm fire in a cold room, a dead man, and the truth beside him. And outside, the snow coming down soft and slow, covering everything, as snow always does, without judgment, without preference, without the slightest interest in what lies beneath it. Poirot turned off the lamp and left the library, and pulled the door closed gently behind him. The little grey cells rested at last. The snow sealed the doors. The truth found its way out regardless. It always does, given enough time, enough quiet, and one man patient enough to listen to what a room has to say.